Today is the 12th of June, 2007. My name is Cassie Potasic, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Moorhead, Minnesota. Could you please tell me your full name?
Marian Elizabeth Dick Sibley.
All right. When and where were you born?
I was born in the farmhouse between Ingleville and Elliott, North Dakota, which is west of Lisbon and Ransom County.
Okay. Right, and when were you born?
When was I born?
Yeah.
May 22nd, 1917.
Okay. Have you ever heard any really interesting stories about your birth?
No, I really haven't.
Okay. Can you tell us some of your earliest memories as a child?
Well, we lived on this farm, and I had brothers and sisters. I had a sister 2.5 years older than I am, and one 2.5 years younger. I was right in the middle. They were both born in the fall. And we went to grade school together, which was a country school 2.5 miles east of our house. We walked part of the time, and evidently my father must have taken us to school occasionally on the colder days. But I remember when we walked home, and in the afternoons, there was a train, a freight train, that the tracks were about 2.5 miles north of our farm. And we would hear that as we were running home in the afternoon. It was just a tremendously loud sound. And we'd see the smoke and this train running across the fields, and we would run because we wanted to be at this particular spot when we saw this train. That's one of the memories I always have, seeing that smoke in the air. And we used to play outside, and I was thinner of the three, I guess. I always said that they were too fat, I guess was the word, that they couldn't climb the trees that I did. I had a lot of fun climbing the trees and looking in the bird nests and telling how many little blue eggs were in there and now how many baby robins, and we just had a great time.
Yeah.
That was some of the memories that I had.
So, were they your primary playmates, those two sisters?
They were.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how many siblings do you have?
Well, I had 4 brothers and 3 sisters, so there were 8 of us. And I always call myself the middle child because there were the 3 older ones, then a brother, and then a sister, then me, and then another sister and another brother. So you see, I was in the middle of the last 5.
Okay.
I always kind of felt that I was the middle child, but I don't know if I really was treated any differently than the rest. But you know, we like to play things like that up.
Yeah. So what can you remember your grandparents? Were they nearby?
My father's mother, I wonder if she didn't live with us at one time, but I was very, very young. And I remember her death, and I remember the day of the funeral. And that's really about all I remember. My grandfather died before I was born, and my maternal grandparents lived in the state of Nebraska, and although my father used to take my mother back to see her family real often. I was either too young or too old to be the child that got to ride in this little car that they had at that time.
Okay. Do you remember the funeral very clearly?
Yes, I do. Do you know it was a day in December, and we were out in this cemetery, and I remember how the wind was blowing, and I can almost still feel the sand hitting my face. Is that something that I should remember that?
Yeah.
That's the only thing I remember about. I do remember that we were, they kept the caskets in the homes at that time. And I remember the casket being off in the corner of the living room. So that's my memory of my paternal grandmother. I always felt kind of cheated that I didn't get to know my grandparents.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How many children did your grandparents have? So how many aunts and uncles would you have had?
Pardon me?
How many aunts and uncles would you have had?
Oh, my father had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. And I remember my uncles being very friendly, or whatever the word was, with us children, but my aunts were kind of standoffish. And both of them that lived, well, 3 of them, one of them gave me piano lessons, so I really liked her. And then the other 2, they just had a hard time with the English language and everything. And that was one thing that was important with my mother and father, that we had to speak English very fluently and everything, But I remember those 2 aunts of mine that they were always kind of backwards, and should I use the word Dutchy? That's kind of the way we felt, I think.
So you said it was really important that you speak English fluently. Did most of your family members speak German then, too?
Well, my mother and father used to speak German when they were alone and together, and we understood German. But my mother was from one part of Russia, and my father from another. And they each had their own dialects. But they understood one another, and we understood both of them. Well, anyway, I had mentioned to my brother, short time before he died, 3 or 4 years ago, I said, I was always amazed at how well my mother and father spoke the English language. They always used the right tense of verbs and everything. It was just amazing because neither one of them had that much of an education. And my brother said, well, they always kept the teacher. And don't you think that might have made a difference? And maybe it did. But they both were so interested in education, where I didn't feel, except my aunt that gave us music lessons, it seemed like my other 2 aunts, my brother's wives, were not that interested in, they didn't see that their children went to high school or anything. So my parents were really here to be American, and they spoke so well. I was always so proud of them.
Yeah.
So.
Your parents Did they come over from Germany or from Russia? Or was it your grandparents who?
My parents,
Your parents?
came from Russia.
Okay.
And I've been reading the things that Jana has done quite a bit of research. And I guess I should have known this before, but I didn't. I didn't pay that much attention, I guess. And their parents, and probably even their grandparents, were followers of Catherine the Great. She took German families to Russia, and both my mother's family and my father's family were amongst those people. And they lived there for quite some years, and then things just didn't turn out the way they evidently had planned. And so they started leaving, and they decided to go to America because probably some of their brothers or sisters or someone from their family had already come to America. So that was their way of getting out of Russia.
So they were together before they immigrated to America? Or did they meet over here, your parents?
Well, my parents, and this is one thing that I didn't know until just a couple weeks ago, I've been going through this. My father's family arrived, and I don't just remember the exact day, but a date. But they arrived here at the Statue of Liberty, whatever, and they arrived the day my father was 9 years old, January 13th. I wonder if it was 1883. I'm not just sure of the date right now. And then my mother's family must have come later, and they arrived at, I think it was Baltimore, which surprised me. I thought that everyone came to America and came, through the Statue of Liberty, but evidently they didn't. And my mother was 10, according to something that I read, so, and she was just a year younger than my father.
So did your parents, before they knew each other, settle nearby each other? Is that how they met, or?
Well, both of the families went to Nebraska, around Norfolk, Nebraska, and the families must have lived quite close together because my mother and father were confirmed in the same class, in the same church, and that's where they met one another. And then they were friends from then until their early 20s when they were married.
All right, we're going to switch gears just a little bit. You said that your parents always kept the teacher.
My parents what?
Kept the teacher?
Yes. Okay, they lived on a farm, and right on we had this big house, and right behind them there was a road and a grove of trees, and then right behind them there was this little schoolhouse. And so, where else would the teacher stay, I suppose, except one of the farms? So my mother and father kept them. And my brothers and sisters went to that school until it was closed, and that must have been about 3 or 4 years before I started first grade.
So, how was your house set up so that you could keep the teacher? Did they just have a room?
She must have had a room upstairs, our house had one bedroom downstairs where my mother and father slept, and then my sisters and I slept in one upstairs, and I just don't even remember her being there because I must have been quite young when they closed that school, and then we had to go to another grade school that was about 2.5 miles east of our place.
Okay. And so you would have started school at that one that was 2.5 miles away?
Yes.
That's where you would have started?
I didn't get to go to that little schoolhouse behind our trees. Everybody else started there up to me, you know.
Right. So was it largely neighbor kids that went to this school? Did you know them
Yes,
before?
it was.
Yeah.
I have found a picture of my 2 older brothers and my sister on the steps of that school with a couple of their cousins and a couple of people that I didn't know, who couldn't identify.
So this little school where you went, was this a one-room schoolhouse?
Yes, it was. It was a one-room school, and it had a heater in the corner with a great big, what would it have been called, around the outside of it, you know. I don't know what it would have. It's been so long ago, but I can still see it. But I wonder if it burned down because then they built a new one. And we had a basement, and we had inside toilets. It was a great improvement over the little one-room school that we had before.
How old were you when you got the new school?
Well, I suppose I was, I don't remember if it was 2nd or 3rd grade, but I remember I was in the 1st grade in the old school.
Okay. So how long did people usually go to school? How many grades in this one-room schoolhouse? 8?
Mm-hmm. And I went to all 8 grades in that school. And I think I only had 2 different teachers. My 1st grade teacher's name was Miss Bai. And then the other teacher that we had, her name was Gladys Babcock. And she taught there, forever. So she had been my teacher for all the rest of my 8 grades. Mm-hmm.
Was it fairly common for everybody to get to go to all 8 grades, or did some people have to stay home and
Well,
help?
I think sometimes the boys especially had to stay home with the field work.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What subjects were you taught in school?
Well, I have one of my report cards.
Do you?
And I had, reading and writing and arithmetic and geography and physiology, I think, which was health, and music. So I think we had a pretty rounded education, you know.
You've mentioned several times now that you've had music lessons. Was your family really musical?
Yes, we were. We used to see there were 4 brothers and 4 sisters. And I have memories of us standing around the piano. One of us was always able to play the piano. We stood around the piano and we sang, probably from the old yellow songbook, and harmonized. So we had a great time.
I bet.
You know, what else was there for us to do? So we spent a lot of time. And then as we started scattering, my brothers would get together with their families, and music has always been a great part of our lives. We have a grandson in St. Paul that left college at one time, lived in California, and he was going to Kenyon College in, is that in Indiana or Ohio? Anyway, he went home. And he played in bands. He went to Toronto and he went to New York and you name it. I don't know how that dear girl ever put up with all this because she waited for him in Oakland, California. And anyway, then they were in Australia and he played in bands there. And he played in bands on the corners in Palo Alto, California. So, you know, he has carried on music more than anyone else in our immediate family. But all of my brothers and their families were great at, they never got together, but what they had a singing fest of some kind. Yeah. And played various instruments, an accordion or piano or whatever they have. So, yes, music has always been a big part of our lives.
Did you sing songs in English, or did you ever sing any of like old German songs or anything like that?
Well, I went to church when I was just a child, and there were two old gentlemen that kind of seemed to lead the singing in church. And I can still just blurt out some of those German songs that they sang, and they were so precise. Every note was right on the note, you know. So that's one thing I don't remember the sermons or anything, but I remember those two gentlemen that always led the music. So.
Do you remember any songs that you'd like to sing for us?
No, not really.
All right. I thought I'd ask. So you said they played pianos and accordions. Anything else?
Well, I can't. Oh, mouth organ.
Okay.
Oh, I remember my father sitting and entertaining us with a mouth organ. He also played the accordion, and he used to sit at the piano. He didn't have any music lessons, but he did his own thing on the piano. It was always kind of interesting. So you see, I guess we just kind of fell into being musicians.
Sounds really neat. I would have loved to hear all of you singing together.
Well, we had to do something to entertain ourselves, didn't we?
Yeah. So, what else did you do to entertain yourselves?
Well, we did play some cards. I just can't remember. Oh, we used to have taffy pulls and things like that, you know. Mother would make taffy and hers would always stay so nice and white, and somehow or another ours always became a little discolored. I can't remember if we ate ours or not. Probably did. And we had our chores. Everyone had to have chores, don't you know? And my sister and I, the one that's 2.5 years younger than I am, she was just here 2 weeks ago from Bozeman, Montana, and we talked about one of our jobs was cleaning the stairs we had this big upstairs in our farm home, and there were 16 steps, and we each dusted 8. And she said, of course, Marian was the oldest, and so she managed to clean the first 8, and then there wasn't quite so much dust to move around. So whether I really was that bossy or not, I don't know. But she likes to play that up, you know.
What other chores did you have to do?
What other chores did we? Well, you know that we girls had to milk cows before we went to school.
Yeah.
And we We had to make our beds and clean up our rooms. I can't remember that I ever had to wash dishes, you know. I hear some gals that talked about having to wash dishes. Seemed like my mother always washed dishes. And then, in the fall, my father was great at hitching up a team of horses, and we had to go out in the cornfield and husk the corn. And they had the lumber wagon, and as we pulled the corn off the stalks, seems I can still hear it when we threw it in there. We also picked the potatoes up in the fall. You know, they had to do a lot to have their own food, and so they had potato fields, and we'd pick up the potatoes, and I think we would have them stored in the basement of our home for the winter. So, oh yeah, we were always kept busy. Helped in the garden, pulling weeds and picking the produce, you know, for meals. So we managed to work.
So, this is a little bit off topic, but the Great Depression, did that hit pretty hard when you were?
Well, you know, we talk about that once in a while, that we never really noticed a depression. We always had our food. I think of my father was, well, I'm sure he was frugal. He was buying land, and those payments had to be made, and so I don't think we had an abundance of things. But we talk about that occasionally, that none of us had anything, so we didn't really notice, you know. And we did have food. He was always a good provider as far as food, and Mother was very resourceful. So I suppose we had to wear each other's hand-me-downs. I can't really remember that, but I suppose we did. But no, we didn't notice depression that much.
Okay.
But I'm sure that maybe our parents did, because I suppose it hit them that they were the ones that had to be conservative and so forth, you know. But we were always just taken care of, and
Yeah.
so didn't know the difference.
Okay. So, gonna go back to what you did as a child. Did you have to do a lot of inside helping with your mom, like cooking or laundry or?
Well, with the cooking, I always felt that somehow or another I was the cleaner. I had to dust and clean, and I can't remember doing it so much, but at the same time I know that I wasn't in the kitchen very often. And even when I was in high school, we didn't live in that farmhouse anymore, because my father and mother moved into the little town of Engleville, North Dakota. And I remember my two sisters and mother out in the kitchen canning fruit in the fall, like peaches. And I was sitting in the bedroom with the old treadle sewing machine, sewing. And here my sisters and my mother, the bedroom was right off the kitchen, so you know I was real close to them and I heard all of it. But no, I never really was the cook in the family.
You moved when partway through your childhood? Why
Pardon
did
me?
you moved into Engleville?
Yes, when I was a junior in high school, this big house that we lived in, one of my brothers was married, And you know, in those days, families lived together if they needed to. And so my brother and his wife and babies kept coming. And so there were these 3 children, and I guess my father just decided it was time for him to quit farming, or being the head of the farmer anyway. So we moved to Ingleville. And but we had these 2 nieces and a nephew that we were brought up with until I was a junior in high school. To this day, we're very, very close. So, didn't even mind these new babies coming. We loved them. It was just the way it was. Then we moved into a house that was much smaller, and we didn't have big clothes closets like we had in that old farmhouse. Everything was different. But then that's where we went to high school, was Ingleville. So that was another reason that I think my father moved, so that we were right in the, town, we're able to walk to school. He had driven us to high school for years, which was only 4.5 miles, but it was still a chore for him every morning to take us, and then every evening to come and pick us up. So.
Was it a lot different to adjust to living in town, or was the town small enough that it wasn't?
It was small, and it didn't make any difference.
Yeah.
We still kind of had the same things to do, I suppose, and going to high school, I suppose maybe we had more classroom work to do, and then we played basketball and had some things like that to do, so some extracurricular things that we didn't have before.
What extracurricular things did you have besides
Well,
basketball?
we had plays, declamations, and we had play day that was kind of like their track meets and so forth. And then I remember I played basketball, and I wasn't very good, and we couldn't cross the center line. We had to play on one end of the gym. We had a very nice high school in Ingleville, and I just recently had breakfast with one of the men that had gone to high school. He was a little older than I am, but we had breakfast together not too long ago, and he mentioned, that we had a good high school, that we had good teachers, and kind of had us ready to go on to college and so forth. So.
What kind of plays did you do? Were you in them?
Oh yeah, I can't remember the names of them anymore, and I don't have notes on anything like that, but oh yeah, we had plays, and of course people came to support us. After all, we put our time in, and there again we had a very good music department, so we were really quite fortunate to always have music.
Were there any major changes in the kind of classes you were taking when you started high school, as opposed to?
I can't really recall that there was anything that was that challenging, more so. Really not. My sister always talks about taking Norwegian. Well, I didn't. I don't know why she did, but anyway, she did. And I guess I just took the usual courses that we needed. So.
Is Ingleville also where you went to church?
Pardon me?
Did you also go to church in
Yes.
Ingleville?
You know, the story is, going back a little bit, when my grandparents lived there, they gave land for the cemetery out there, and right across the road from there, uh, another family that owned that were going to give land for the church. But somehow or that never materialized. I think maybe this man died before this happened or something. So in my reading, I find that then in Ingleville, there were groups of people that were building a church, so they invited this group of people to join them, and that's where my family still goes to church, in Ingleville. Now, whether it's the same, it could be the same building, but they have added on to it, of course. So that's where we went to church.
Now, going to church, where most of the people who went, did they speak German? Was German a big part of church?
Well, there was, I remember going to German church, and I was confirmed in German, which I didn't appreciate because I didn't understand. And that it was a different dialect, too, than my parents talked. So I never was happy about that. And I suppose we went to church whether we understood it or not. We did go to Sunday school, and I think that even some of that was German. But so we just did what we had to do.
So was it fairly common with the people you lived around, your neighbors and those sorts of people, to be German-speaking people?
Not really. You know, we lived about 9 miles from Fort Ransom. You know where Fort Ransom is? Now, that was a Norwegian settlement, and they hung on to speaking Norwegian. Now, our people, you see, my brothers, my father's brothers lived in this area about 4 miles from one another. They all built homes and they lived there. And we kind of had our own little settlement, but there were a lot of other German families around there. No, we did not, you did not hear German on the street corners or anything like that. Everybody talked English. So maybe not everybody, but as a rule, you know. But I remember that my one uncle was a county commissioner, and he learned to speak Norwegian because everybody in Fort Ransom and in that area spoke Norwegian. So he just went along and learned it.
That would explain why they taught it in high school, and your sister took it, I suppose.
Well, I suppose that there must have been a reason that I suppose, I don't know, it was an elective, I suppose, that some people picked up. There were some Norwegian families that went to school in Ingleville, so they did have Norwegian, but no German. When you were asking about the Depression, maybe that's when we noticed there was a depression, because we lived at Ingleville. Valley City, North Dakota was 50 miles away, and that's where, I guess, did my father even know there was anything beyond Valley City? And that's where we ended up going to college. So my sister that was older than I went to college there. Then I am now ready to go to college, graduated from high school. That's where I went. And then my younger sister also went there. Okay, didn't cost that much. I just can't believe when I think of what the tuition was, but it was kind of a effort to have the money. And I waited, we had, what was it called anyway? Some program that we could work part-time, and I remember I worked in the dining room. If I worked all month, I think I got $15. And I worked part-time, so I got $7.50. Now, how far do you think that $7.50 went? But evidently, you know, it must have been helpful. So I graduated from there with my 2-year college degree that now I could teach. And so I had a job in a rural school, 8 grades, and I taught for $70 a month. That was my first job. Well, recently, someone was talking about the money that they were earning, and this lady said, and I babysat for $2.50 a day when I was that age. And it just occurred to me that at $70 a month, I was teaching for $2.50 a day. So how would you like to have lived in those times? See, we didn't know any difference, so it didn't make any difference. But anyway, yes, I taught for $2.50 a day.
Wow.
But I enjoyed it, I guess, and I kept on going to school. And
Where was your first job? Where was the schoolhouse?
My first job was in Allegheny number 2, or maybe it was Allegheny number 1, I don't know. It was just a few miles from where I went to grade school. And it was in the area where my father owned land, and somebody needed a teacher. And I guess I didn't have too much to say about it. They asked if I wanted, they probably asked my father if I wanted the job, because I ended up teaching there. It was in Ransom County. And I taught in rural schools for 2 years, and then I went to Gonvick, Minnesota. And I think I must have gotten maybe $80 a month, but then I lived away from home. And but anyway, I got to do things that were a little different than living in the farm.
Why did you move into Minnesota? Just for the job, or?
Oh, when did I move in?
Yep.
Now when we moved here? My husband got a job with the railroad. He worked for the railroad. And the job here opened in 1969. And that's when we moved here to Minnesota, to Moorhead.
The schoolhouse where you taught, where you made $80, that was in Minnesota too, right?
No, that was North Dakota.
North-
Oh, yes, the
Yes,
second one
yes.
was in Gonvick, Minnesota.
Okay. And why did you decide to move there?
Well, after I taught there in Ransom County 2 years, I guess I just kind of wanted to get away or something. And so we would get the information from the state where there were jobs, and I guess I just applied there and I got the job. So
Was that the first time you had really been away from home?
except when I went to school at Valley
Right.
City for those 2 years.
Okay. Was that a really different experience for you then?
Pardon me?
Was it really hard for you to be away?
Oh, no.
Or no? Was it exciting?
And I stayed at the private homes in Gonvick, and I taught first, second, and third grade, and I had 39 kids. I don't know how any of them ever learned to read, but I never heard that any of them didn't. And I taught there 2 years, and then I came back to our home in Inglevale, and that's where I met my husband. And he was working for the railroad then, and then we were married, and I taught there for a year. And then in 1941, we were married, and I kind of drifted from teaching, I guess, then for a while until I had my family, which started in 1944. And then I just stayed home until I had them all three in grade school. Then I went back to teach again. And then I got $2,700 for the year.
Oh.
So that was just a little bit more than $630 that I had made the first year. Then I started going back to college and got my bachelor's right before we moved to Moorhead, which was good because that increased my salary.
So you said you were married in
41. 1941.
Were you affected at all by the World War?
Well, yes, my husband was drafted, but then because he was working for the railroad, somehow or another they felt that they needed him on the job, so he was deferred. But there were anxious times because, okay, was his deferment going to be acknowledged, or would he be going? So yes, we had some anxious times.
Yeah.
One of his jobs was not very pleasant. When there was a death, he often had to be the one that delivered this message to the families, and that was pretty hurtful.
Yeah.
So I remember those times that weren't easy for him.
Yeah.
So maybe it would have been, and I think he regrets the fact that he, didn't go, but that's just the way it was for him.
Yeah.
So,
How about your brothers? Did any of them get drafted?
pardon me?
Your brothers, did any of them?
No, they were all on the farm, and they were all older, I guess, and so none of them were drafted at the time. So,
Okay.
but it's hurtful even if it isn't your family.
Yeah.
Just like what we're going through right now. Don't we hurt
Yeah.
every time that we hear that there's a death? Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
So I guess it was the same then. As I was going through some of the material that I've had on, but haven't really paid that much attention to it, there was one article that my granddaughter did when she was going to she was only in the 6th grade, I think, in Palo Alto, California, and she did this research and found out that, anyway, the story says that she found this out, that my mother's mother had decided that she was leaving Russia because she had this one son that may be taken into the Russian, enlisted into the Russian army. And she was not. She had 8 daughters and the one son, and she was not to give him up. So she told her husband that she was going to go to America, whether he would or not. And I guess he really resisted. And then when he did come to America, he was very lonely, very homesick. But then they must have adjusted and everything went fine for them. But it was interesting that the hardships that they went through, they had left, I think they were in Frank, Russia, and they had left there and went as far as Turkey. And then I wonder if there was an eye disease or something that, anyway, they were quarantined and they had to go back. And then 2 years later, then they made the effort to leave again. Some of the hardships that they had, for instance, I think it was my grandmother Stroh's sister became ill and died on the trip, and they just had to throw her overboard. Sounds terrible. So those are some of the things that they, the hardships that they encountered when they came. And then when they did come to America, they had quite a time. My grandfather, with these 8 girls, had to make a living for them. And they did about anything that they could to have money. They worked in beet fields and did lots of menial jobs and moved quite often. I guess they had moved to Michigan. They went wherever there was work. And mother's youngest sister was quite a, well, what do you call it, quite hard, I guess. She used to, they didn't want to be Russian. They were now in America, and they did not want to be Russian. So when my granddaughter finished her little interview with, their work in the library, and then she interviewed my mother, and she interviewed me, and all these things, and she got it all together. She made the statement, "Oh, I'm so glad I'm Russian." And I thought, too bad mother's sisters can't be here to hear this, because they didn't want anyone to know that they were Russian. So anyway, Widebrook decided, after what she had found, why she decided that it was okay to be Russian, I don't know. But it's kind of a cute little article that she wrote, along with the things that Jana has done. Why I have learned quite a bit of the things about my parents.
It's really neat. You said that your grandfather was very homesick.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
He just had a hard time. Well, I suppose it was hard for him to find work, and quite a responsibility to support a family that large. And he was a good farmer in Russia, so this is something that he kept doing. I wonder if I didn't read somewhere that he also had been a builder, a carpenter. So anyway,
I imagine.
hardships.
Yeah. I imagine that where they settled in America looked very different. It was a very different environment than where they had been in Russia,
Right.
too, which would make it hard. Anything else about your parents and their hardships?
Well, I think then when they came here, my grandfather, my father's father, had moved to North Dakota and had most of his family here. But you see, my father, Philip, married this gal from Nebraska, and so he lived there for a while. Well, then my paternal grandfather wanted that son also to be here so that he could have his whole family here. And I guess that's how my father moved here. And they bought land in Allegheny Township in Ransom County, and lived in sod houses and granaries and what have you until they became established. But the land that they bought is still being farmed by nephews and grandnephews in my family. After all these years, it's still in the hands of the same family.
That's really neat. Well, I wanted to know if you had anything else you wanted to talk about when you were doing your college or your teaching, or...
Well, college wasn't that easy either, I don't suppose, when we came from little high schools from Engleville. Oh, but we made it through. And like I said, tuition wasn't very much, but I suppose it was a lot. And I stayed in a dorm where I worked part-time, like I said, in the dining room. And I can't remember too much about the classes that I took, but it was interesting. And I belonged to a cappella choir, and we had our spring tour, which was always kind of fun. And I think we traveled with a bus, and then we would stay at various homes when we performed. And one of the performances I remember was at Pheasant in North Dakota, and this lovely big old home and then we stayed in the homes, you see. We had our dinners, and then we stayed in the homes, and there was this lovely lady, I think I can still almost see her, and the beautiful meal we had. That was always a highlight. Also, I was in a play, and I was a flamingo. I kind of remember that. As far as the subjects were concerned, and the instructors that I had, I have kind of just put them aside, I guess. Then I got my batch. I had 2 years in. And then after my children were in first, third, and fifth grade, I went back to school, and I got my bachelor's at Allendale, North Dakota, which is now a Bible school, I think, in Allendale. And I was in the last graduating class of Allendale So then after I came to Moorhead, now I didn't have to drive 50 miles to go to class. So I enrolled in classes immediately at Moorhead State and at Concordia, at NDSU. I loved being a student. I always taught first grade, but there were always subjects that I could take that helped me become a better first grade teacher, and I needed that. You need to become a better first grade teacher. And I really enjoyed my years of teaching. I was just kind of sorry I had the hours for a master's, but I didn't pursue it. And in December, my one granddaughter graduated with her bachelor's at Moorhead State. And I was kind of thinking at that time to see if I could get my credentials together and maybe surprise her and graduate with her, but I didn't do it. Kind of sorry too afterwards, but you know, sometimes things look just too big, don't you know?
Yeah. How many years did you teach?
What years did I teach?
Yep.
Well, I taught many years, but my last 15 were here in Moorhead. I taught in Lincoln until it closed, Lincoln and Moorhead. We did have a Lincoln and Moorhead. Then I taught a transition group in Washington School for a year, and then I came to Probsfield, and that's where I taught until I retired in 1985.
Oh, okay.
So, I enjoyed my first grade.
Yeah.
I really did. A lot of little heartaches and all of these things, but it's fun to see them learn to read, and they think it's fun. They don't want to read pictures forever. They actually want to read stories, don't you know?
Did you always really like little kids?
Yes, I did. I still do.
Yeah.
I have a little great-granddaughter, Molly, right now, and she is a charmer.
Yeah.
And she's learning to read. She's 4.5.
Wow.
And knows her alphabet and all those things. I saw her evaluation recently, and one of the questions was, Molly, what comes after 29? And she said 2010. That's so typical after all. 10 comes after 9. So that's why it's fun to teach first grade. So,
Well, you must have been very passionate about it to do it so many years.
yes, I should say, I taught 33.5 years in all. I taught 1 year in Glendive, Montana.
Oh.
You know, sometimes you just need to see what is going on somewhere else. So I did that, but then I came back, and I was glad to be back home.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you just a few more questions to wrap this up. Why do you think it's important to tell your life story?
Why do I think? Well, I wish I would have known more about my own parents. I guess we just never really took time to do it, and is it really important? I suppose it is.
Is there any other thoughts or stories you'd like to share?
Not really, I don't think.
All right, well, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Well, you're sure welcome. Like I've said to my nieces, I hope that I do our family justice. We're a proud family, you know.
Oh, you did a
We
wonderful
are.
job.